In the humid autumn of 1941, with the world holding its breath on the precipice of a wider war, Agent Thomas Callahan of the Department of Justice was dispatched from Washington, D.C. to the languid backwaters of St. Amelia Parish, Tuck, Louisiana. His assignment was mundane, a bureaucratic loose end that irritated the meticulous sensibilities of his superiors. It concerned a decade-old land seizure case, federal in jurisdiction, whose archival file was incomplete. Several key witness depositions were noted in the docket, but were physically absent from the records, an anomaly that required a simple on-site verification and retrieval. Callahan was a man who thrived on order, a believer in the unassailable logic of ledgers and legal precedent. He arrived in the parish seat of Moreauville with his neatly pressed suit already feeling damp and heavy in the oppressive, syrupy air. The town moved at a pace that felt alien to him, governed by the slow rotation of ceiling fans and the thick, unhurried drawl of its inhabitants. The courthouse itself was a relic of a bygone era, a formidable brick building that seemed to sweat under the relentless sun, its corridors smelling of floor wax and damp, decaying paper. His initial inquiries were met with a peculiar form of Southern courtesy that was both polite and profoundly unhelpful. The parish clerk, an elderly man with rheumy eyes named Mr. Hibbert, recalled the case vaguely but professed no knowledge of the missing documents. He attributed their absence to the disorganization of his predecessor, or perhaps the notorious humidity, which he claimed could turn paper to pulp if not properly stored. Callahan sensed a quiet but firm wall being erected around his questions, a shared reluctance to disturb the settled dust of the past. The case file, when he finally held it in his hands, was thick and brittle. It detailed a dispute over a large tract of cypress swamp, land the federal government had claimed for a conservation project. The details were tedious, filled with property surveys and legal arguments. Yet the docket list was clear, listing the names of 5 individuals who had provided sworn testimony: a trapper named Jean-Paul Arsenault, a midwife named Elodie Thibodeau, and 3 members of the same family, the Lafleur. These were the names whose voices had been silenced by time or neglect. Callahan spent his first evening in a small, stuffy hotel room, the drone of cicadas a constant, soaring presence outside his window. He laid out his notes, creating a neat grid of facts and questions. The task should have been simple: locate duplicates of the testimonies in local archives, have them certified, and return to the crisp, orderly world of Washington. Yet a subtle feeling of unease had taken root in him. The clerks practiced forgetfulness, the way the name of the disputed land was never spoken aloud. It all felt less like incompetence and more like a carefully maintained silence. He reviewed the initial report from the agent who had presided over the case in 1931. The man had made a specific note of the witness testimonies, calling them clear and compelling. This confirmed they had once existed, that they were not phantom entries. Their disappearance was a physical event, an act of removal that had happened sometime in the intervening decade. This was no longer just about misfiled papers. It was an investigation into an act of deliberate expungement, a subtle but definite violation of the historical record. As he worked, a single drop of condensation from a water pipe above traced a slow, dark path down the floral wallpaper of his room. It felt like a tear shed by the house itself. He felt like an intruder, an unwelcome presence disturbing a fragile truce with the past. The local officials saw him as a meddlesome outsider, a man from a distant government who could not possibly understand their ways. They were correct, but Callahan was determined that this would not impede his work. Logic and procedure were universal languages. He decided his next course of action. If the official records were a dead end, he would have to step outside them. He would seek out the unofficial record, the living memory of the parish. He would try to find people who remembered the case, who remembered the trapper, the midwife, or the Lafleur family. He would reconstruct the missing testimonies not from paper, but from the whispers and recollections of St. Amelia Parish. He did not yet know he was searching for ghosts. In the morning, he walked out into the thick white fog that had rolled in from the bayou overnight. The world was obscured, its shape softened and made mysterious. It was a fitting atmosphere for the task ahead. He was no longer just a records agent. He was an archaeologist of a buried truth. He would have to dig patiently through layers of silence, fear, and time to uncover the foundation of the mystery, unaware that the ground beneath his feet was profoundly unstable. The weight of the parish seemed to settle on him, a physical pressure in the humid air. He felt the gaze of unseen eyes from the shadowed verandas of the old houses he passed. Every quiet town has its secrets, and he knew, but the secrets of St. Amelia felt different. They felt active, guarded by a consensus of silence that was as formidable as any locked courthouse door. He was a man of facts, and he was stepping into a place where facts had been deliberately drowned. His mission was to restore a small piece of the official record, to fill a gap in a forgotten file. But as he started his work that foggy morning, a deeper question began to form in his mind. What truth was so dangerous that it had to be not merely hidden, but erased entirely? What had those 5 witnesses seen a decade ago that required their very words, and perhaps more, to vanish from the face of the earth? He pulled the collar of his coat tighter, a useless gesture against the clinging dampness. The simple retrieval mission was over. A true investigation had just begun. He was determined to find the missing pages, to hear the silenced voices. He could not possibly imagine the cost of succeeding, nor could he fathom the nature of the entity that had demanded their silence in the first place. Agent Callahan's second day in Moreauville was dedicated to a meticulous, inch-by-inch examination of the parish's public records. He was searching for any official trace of the 5 vanished witnesses, a task he assumed would be straightforward. People do not simply cease to exist on paper. They leave a trail of ink and stamps, birth certificates, census entries, marriage licenses, property deeds, and finally, death records. This trail, he believed, was immutable, a testament to a life lived. He began in the musty basement of the courthouse, a cavern of leather-bound ledgers and stacked document boxes. With the reluctant assistance of Mr. Heber, he pulled the census records for 1930 and 1940. He started with the trapper, Jean-Paul Arsenault. He searched the rolls for St. Amelia Parish, then for the surrounding parishes, his finger tracing line after line of handwritten names. The name was not there. It was not a matter of it being overlooked. It simply did not appear in the official count of souls. Thinking it a simple clerical error, he moved on to the midwife, Elodie Thibodeau. Her profession should have made her a well-known figure, her name appearing on the birth records of countless children. He spent hours poring over the vital statistics archives, his initial optimism slowly souring into a cold dread. He found dozens of births from the era, but none were attended by a midwife of that name. It was as if she had practiced her trade with an invisible hand, leaving no mark of her passage. The Lafleur family proved to be the most profound and disturbing anomaly. A family of 3, father, mother, and son, cannot simply be overlooked in a census. He expanded his search, looking for any variation of the spelling, any possible error in transcription. There was nothing. According to the official records of the United States government and St. Amelia Parish, the Lafleur family had never lived, never paid taxes, never owned property, and never died. They were a complete and total blank. Callahan felt a prickle of cold sweat on his neck, a feeling that had nothing to do with the Louisiana heat. This was not a case of missing documents. This was a systematic and impossibly thorough erasure. He returned to the original court case file, his hands shaking almost imperceptibly. He examined the pages with a newfound, horrified attention. Under the focused beam of his desk lamp, he could see the subtle signs of tampering he had missed before. On the docket sheet where the witnesses' names were listed, he noticed a faint discoloration of the paper, a subtle thinning. Someone with a surgeon's steady hand had used a sharp blade to scrape away the ink of their home addresses, which had presumably been listed next to their names. In another section, a page had been skillfully cut out, the stub of its binding so close to the spine it was almost invisible. It was the page where the summary of testimony should have been. This discovery shifted the investigation into a terrifying new register. Who possessed the skill and the authority to perpetrate such a fraud? This was not the work of a disgruntled local hiding evidence of a crime. This required access to state and federal records, the ability to alter census rolls and purge vital statistics. It implied a conspiracy of unbelievable depth and reach, a shadowy authority with the power to edit history itself, to unperson citizens with the stroke of a pen and the scrape of a blade. He felt a wave of professional vertigo. His entire career, his entire worldview was built upon the sanctity of the official record. A document was a fact, a piece of objective truth. But here, in this sleepy, forgotten parish, the record had been shown to be a fiction, a malleable narrative that could be rewritten by an unknown author for an unknowable purpose. The ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. It was a trapdoor waiting to spring. He abandoned the courthouse, the smell of old paper now seeming to him the scent of lies. He needed air, needed to escape the suffocating weight of those doctored ledgers. He walked toward the edge of town, where the paved roads gave way to dirt tracks that disappeared into the dark maw of the cypress swamp. The natural world felt more honest, its cycles of life and death more transparent than the corrupted archives of men. He thought about the initial land seizure case. It seemed so trivial, a minor bureaucratic function of the government. Why would it necessitate such an extraordinary cover-up? What could 5 ordinary people, a trapper, a midwife, a family, have said about a piece of swampland that would provoke such a powerful and terrifying response? The secret they held must have been of monumental importance, a truth so antithetical to the established order that its very utterance had to be erased. As dusk began to fall, painting the sky in lurid shades of orange and purple, Callahan stood at the edge of the bayou. The dark, still water reflected the sky, and for a moment it was impossible to tell which was real and which was the reflection. This, he thought, was a perfect metaphor for his investigation. He was trapped between a reality he could no longer trust and a hidden truth he could not yet see. His belief in a world of solid facts was gone, replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. The mystery was no longer about what the witnesses had said. It was about what force had the power to silence them so completely. Callahan felt a new kind of fear, not of physical danger, but of a conceptual horror. He was fighting an enemy who could not be seen, who could not be named, whose weapon was the very structure of reality and record he had sworn to uphold. He was a man armed with the law, facing an entity that simply rewrote the law and the people out of existence. With the official avenues of investigation revealing not just a dead end, but a meticulously constructed void, Agent Callahan knew he had to turn to the parish's unofficial history. He had to plumb the depths of memory and rumor, a source of information he, as a man of facts, had always disdained. He began to spend his days in the small, dusty shops of Moreauville, in the dim light of its only tavern, and on the sun-drenched verandas of its oldest residents, nursing glasses of iced tea and listening. His presence was a known quantity now, the subject of quiet speculation. He was the man from the government, the outsider, asking about things long past. At first, his questions about the Lafleur family or Jean-Paul Arsenault were met with blank stares and shakes of the head. The names, which should have been familiar in a community so small, seemed to evoke a collective and practiced amnesia. It was a wall of silence, not of hostility, but of a deep, ingrained fear. Callahan learned to change his approach. He stopped asking direct questions about the names. Instead, he spoke of the old days, of the Great Depression, of the Big Flood of 27. He became a patient listener, a repository for the rambling recollections of the elderly. And slowly, cautiously, fragments began to emerge. The fragments were never offered in response to a direct question, but would appear obliquely, like objects floating to the surface of a dark swamp. An old woman rocking on her porch, speaking of her childhood, mentioned a kind family who lived down by the Black Cypress Bayou, a family who kept to themselves, but were generous with their catch from the river. She did not name them, but her eyes held a distant, sorrowful look. When Callahan gently pressed for a name, her expression shuttered, and she abruptly changed the subject to the quality of this year's cotton crop, the moment of openness gone as quickly as it had appeared. In the tavern, a man whose hands were stained with the bayou's mud told a long, rambling story about his grandfather, a renowned trapper. He boasted that his grandfather knew every inch of the swamp, except for one particular stretch. He called it the Hushlands, a place the old folks said was wrong, a place where the birds didn't sing and the water was always unnaturally still. The man spoke of it with a kind of superstitious bravado, but beneath it, Callahan detected a genuine, inherited fear. The midwife, Elodie Thibodeau, was the most difficult to find. She existed only as a ghost in the stories of other women. One woman recalled her own mother speaking of a shadow wife, a healer who lived deep in the swamp and used old, forgotten remedies. She was said to come only at night, to help with difficult births that the town doctor wouldn't touch. She was a figure of folklore, a creature of the bayou, not a woman of flesh and blood who would sign a legal document. These whispers and fragments painted a strange, spectral picture of the 5 witnesses. They were not integrated members of the community. They were outsiders in their own land, people who lived on the fringes, both geographically and socially. They were all connected to the swamp, to the very piece of land that the federal government had seized. They were the human extensions of that wild, untamed place, and their knowledge was not the knowledge of the town. The atmosphere of St. Amelia Parish began to work on Callahan. The relentless humidity, the fecund smell of rot and life, the constant low thrum of insects, it all contributed to a sense of reality thinning, of the mundane world giving way to something older and more primal. He would have dreams of the bayou at night, of dark water and cypress trees draped in Spanish moss that looked like the grey beards of drowned men. The swamp was becoming a character in his investigation. He felt the weight of the community's shared secret. It was a palpable presence in the air, in the averted gazes and the sudden silences that fell when he approached. This was not a conspiracy of a few powerful men. It was a conspiracy of the entire parish, a pact of forgetting that had been held for a decade. They had collectively agreed that some things were better left buried, that some stories were too dangerous to tell. He began to feel a grudging respect for their silence. It was born of terror. Whatever had happened in 1931, whatever the witnesses had seen, it had been powerful enough to frighten an entire community into submission. It had convinced them that ignorance was the only viable form of survival. They had excised the memory from their public lives, allowing it to fester only in the dark corners of folklore and whispered warnings. One afternoon, he found an old parish map from the 1920s, tucked away in the back of a failing bookstore. It was a hand-drawn, unofficial document, created for hunters and fishermen, and on it, deep in the area marked as the Black Cypress Bayou, he saw a small hand-drawn cross. Next to it, in faded ink, was a single, chilling annotation, La Fleur's Landing. It was the first physical, tangible proof of their existence he had found. The discovery sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. The family was real. Their home had a location. He was no longer chasing phantoms. He was tracing a map to a place that had been deliberately wiped from all official charts. He folded the map carefully, the brittle paper crackling in protest. He knew that his investigation was about to take another turn, leading him away from the relative safety of the town and into the heart of the hushlands. The parish had shared its whispers, its fragments of truth wrapped in layers of fear. They had given him clues they did not even know they possessed, but their knowledge ended at the edge of the swamp. To go further, to understand the source of the silence, he would have to enter the domain of the vanished witnesses himself. He would have to walk into the place where the birds didn't sing and hope he could find his way out again. Agent Callahan's discovery of the old trapper's map gave him a concrete destination, Lafleur's Landing. The name itself felt like an incantation, a key to a locked room. Before venturing into the treacherous terrain of the Black Cypress Bayou, however, he felt a need for one more piece of ballast, one more anchor to the world of tangible evidence. He needed to see a face. A photograph, he reasoned, was an undeniable truth, a moment of captured light that could not be easily erased or denied. His search led him to the St. Amelia Catholic Church, a stark white building whose steeple seemed to pierce the heavy sky. He reasoned that a family as established as the Lafleur, even living on the fringes, would have connections to the church through baptisms, marriages, or funerals. The church's records were independent of the parish's, a separate stream of history. He hoped that stream had not been poisoned by the same fear. The parish priest was a young, nervous man who seemed intimidated by Callahan's federal credentials. He granted him access to the church's archive, a small, humid room in the back of the rectory filled with disorganized boxes of photographs, bulletins, and parish registries. The air was thick with the scent of aging paper and beeswax. It was another library of the past, and Callahan began his patient archaeological dig. For 2 days he searched, his fingers growing numb and dusty. He examined faded registries, his eyes scanning for the familiar, ghost-like names. He found nothing. The records were as clean and empty as those in the courthouse. It seemed the erasure had been thorough here as well. Defeated, he was about to leave when his gaze fell upon a large, unassuming cardboard box in the corner labeled simply Parish Socials, 1925-1935. It was a long shot, but he opened it. The box was filled with dozens of amateur photographs, curled and yellowed with age, capturing the life of the community in candid moments, picnics on the church lawn, Christmas pageants, summer fairs. They were images of a world that seemed innocent and impossibly distant. He began to look through them one by one, studying the faces, searching for anyone who seemed apart from the crowd, anyone with the look of an outsider. And then he found it. The photograph was undated, tucked between a picture of a baptism and one of a bake sale. It depicted a small group of people gathered near the edge of the woods, clearly on the periphery of a larger church picnic. In the center of the small group was a man and a woman, their faces etched with a deep solemnity that contrasted with the forced smiles of those around them. Between them stood a young boy, his eyes wide and dark, staring directly at the camera. Callahan's breath caught in his throat. He had no way of knowing for certain, but he felt a powerful, intuitive conviction. This was the Lafleur family. The man had a quiet strength, the woman a resilient sadness. The boy looked as if he was seeing more than just the camera, as if he was looking at the person holding it, at the future, at Callahan himself sitting in that dusty room. They were exactly as he had imagined them, separate, watchful, and deeply connected to the land at their backs. He turned the photograph over. On the back, written in a faint spidery pencil script, were the words, "The Lafleur, after the blessing of the grounds." The grounds, not the land, not the property, but the grounds. The phrasing was strange, sacramental. It implied the land itself was something to be blessed, to be sanctified, or perhaps to be placated. It was another piece of the puzzle, another hint at the unusual nature of the place they called home. He felt a profound sense of triumph mixed with an eerie chill. He now held in his hand physical proof of a family that, according to the state, had never been born. This small, faded piece of cardboard was a direct contradiction to the systematic erasure. It was a ghost that had refused to fade, a single, stubborn fact in a sea of carefully constructed lies. It made the conspiracy feel real and fallible, yet it also made the vanished family feel tragically, heartbreakingly real. He slipped the photograph into the inner pocket of his coat, the warmth of his body pressing against the cool, flat surface. It felt like a sacred artifact, a relic of a lost people. The faces of the Lafleurs were now imprinted on his mind. They were no longer just names on a docket. They were a family, captured in a moment of communal life, their quiet dignity a silent rebuke to the forces that had sought to unmake them. Leaving the church, the daylight seemed harsh and unreal. The world of the living felt thin compared to the vivid reality of the family in the photograph. Callahan understood that his investigation had become something more than a professional duty. It was now a personal quest, a moral obligation. He was not just seeking to restore a record, he was seeking to restore a family to history, to give them back the existence that had been stolen from them. The photograph changed the nature of the evidence. Before, he had only absences, voids, and whispers. Now he had a presence, he had faces. And those faces, particularly the haunting, knowing eyes of the young boy, seemed to demand an accounting. They were a silent jury, and he was the advocate for their case, arguing against an opponent who had the power to make the courtroom and everyone in it disappear. As he walked back to his hotel, the weight of the photograph in his pocket felt immense. It was a dangerous piece of knowledge. It proved the lie. He knew that possessing it made him a threat to the deep, abiding silence of St. Elia Parish. He had found his first ghost, and he had a growing suspicion that the ghost might not be friendly, and that it was not alone. Armed with the map to Lafleur's Landing and the haunting image of the family, Agent Callahan began to suspect that the land seizure case was merely a pretext, a stage upon which a much deeper drama had played out. He started to re-examine the timeline, not just of the case, but of the parish itself. He spent his days in the offices of the local newspaper, the Moroville Monitor, scrolling through spools of microfilm until his eyes burned, searching for a pattern in the mundane rhythm of local life. He was not looking for overt clues, but for dissonances, for small, seemingly unrelated events that occurred around the time of the court case in 1931. He catalogued every fire, every reported accident, every bout of sickness, every disappearance that was noted in the paper's dry, factual columns. He was creating a secret history of the parish, a chronicle of its sorrows and misfortunes, hoping to find a thread that would connect them to the vanished witnesses. Slowly, a disturbing pattern began to take shape. In the months leading up to the land seizure case, there was a spike in unusual incidents, all concentrated in the geographic area of the Black Cypress Bayou. A freak lightning strike had ignited a centuries-old oak tree on the edge of the swamp. A sudden, localized blight had wiped out the crops of several farms that bordered the so-called hush lands. These events were reported as natural, if unfortunate, occurrences, but Callahan, with his new, paranoid perspective, saw something else. He cross-referenced the locations of these incidents with the faint memories he had gathered from the townspeople. The farm that suffered the blight had belonged to a cousin of the Lafleur family. The trapper, Jean-Paul Arsenault, had reportedly lost a full season's worth of traps in a flash flood that had affected only a small, specific tributary of the bayou. The same tributary that led to Lafleur's Landing. It was circumstantial, but the connections were becoming too numerous to ignore. It seemed as if some malevolent force was methodically isolating the 5 witnesses, severing their connections to the community, destroying their livelihoods. It was a campaign of attrition designed to weaken them, to make them vulnerable, long before their testimony was ever required in a federal court. The land seizure case was not the beginning of their trouble, it was the end. The midwife, Elodie Thibodeau, remained the most elusive figure, but then he found it, a small, almost unnoticeable article from the summer of 1931, reporting on a strange swamp fever that had afflicted several infants in the outlying areas of the parish. The town doctor was quoted as being baffled by the illness, which caused a high fever followed by a strange, placid listlessness. The article noted that all the afflicted infants had been born with the assistance of an unlicensed local practitioner. The implication was chilling. The swamp fever was a smear, a whisper campaign designed to discredit the midwife, to turn the community against her by painting her as a source of contagion and bad medicine. Callahan felt a surge of cold anger. The entity he was investigating was not just powerful, it was cruel and cunning, using fear and superstition as weapons to isolate its targets before erasing them completely. He realized the 5 witnesses were not chosen at random. They were all guardians of a sort. The Lafleur were the keepers of a specific piece of land. Arsenault was a master of the swamp's physical terrain. Elodie Thibodeau was a keeper of its hidden, esoteric knowledge of folk remedies and ancient ways. They were the human immune system of the bayou, and the force he was investigating was a disease that had eliminated them in order to take root. This new understanding changed his perception of the mystery. He was not just investigating a missing persons case. He was uncovering a silent, undeclared war. A war between a modern, rational world of government land seizures and legal documents, and an older, more primal world protected by a small group of fringe dwellers. The witnesses had been casualties of this war, their testimony the final act of defiance before they were overrun. He began to feel a profound connection to them, a kinship with these lost souls. He, too, was now an outsider, a man operating on the fringes, using methods that his superiors would not understand. He was trying to piece together a truth from whispers and shadows, just as Elodie Thibodeau had likely pieced together her remedies from the plants and secrets of the swamp. He was a keeper of their memory, the last person on earth who was trying to understand their story. The work took its toll. He grew thin, his eyes taking on a feverish intensity. He spent his nights poring over the maps and microfilm, the faces from the photograph seeming to watch him from his desk. The threads were all there, weaving a tapestry of malice and methodical destruction. The land seizure case was the linchpin, the formal event that had forced the hidden conflict out into the open and necessitated the final, drastic act of erasure. He now understood the why of their selection, but he still did not understand the central question. What was the secret they were protecting? What was it about that particular piece of land, Lafleur's Landing, that was so important? What had they seen or known that had to be silenced at any cost? The answer to that question, he knew, did not lie in the archives of the town, but in the dark, still heart of the swamp itself. The pattern was clear, the thread of conspiracy woven through the mundane history of the parish. He felt he was standing on the edge of a great precipice, looking down into a darkness that had been carefully hidden for a decade. He had followed the unseen threads to their source. Now, all that was left was to follow them into the labyrinth and confront whatever monster waited at its center. Having established the systematic nature of the witnesses' isolation and erasure, Agent Callahan felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere around him. The passive, watchful silence of the parish began to feel more active, more personal. He developed the unshakable sensation that he was being observed, not just by the wary townspeople, but by something more focused, more intent. The unseen enemy he was investigating was no longer just a subject of his research. It was now aware of him. The feeling began in subtle ways. He would return to his locked hotel room to find objects slightly out of place. A pen on his desk would be angled differently. A page in his notebook would be turned, though he was certain he had left it closed. These were minute disturbances, easily dismissed as tricks of memory or fatigue, yet they accumulated, creating a persistent hum of low-grade paranoia in the back of his mind. Then came the auditory phenomena. Late at night, as he tried to sleep in the suffocating stillness of his room, he would hear things. A soft, dry, scraping sound from within the walls, like a fingernail being dragged across old wood. The sound of a floorboard creaking in the supposedly empty hallway outside his door. He would jolt awake, his heart pounding, only to be met with a profound and absolute silence. The sounds were always on the very edge of perception, impossible to verify. He tried to rationalize it. The hotel was old, its timbers prone to settling. The paranoia was a natural byproduct of his obsessive investigation, of sleepless nights and the oppressive, unnerving environment. He was a man of reason, and he clung to logical explanations like a drowning man to a raft. But the feeling of being watched, of being a specimen under an invisible microscope, only intensified. One evening, he was working late in the courthouse archives, the only person in the cavernous building. He was hunched over a large property map, cross-referencing it with his own hand-drawn chart of the bayou, when he heard it. A single, soft footstep from the far end of the long, shadowed aisle of shelves. He froze, every nerve ending tingling. He called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. There was no reply. Armed with a heavy Maglite flashlight, he conducted a thorough search of the archives, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. He found nothing. All the doors were locked from the inside. There was no one there. Yet as he returned to his table, he saw that a single, leather-bound ledger had been pulled partially from its shelf, a book he had not touched all evening. It was the parish death registry for 1931. His blood ran cold. The message was clear. You are being watched, and your search is leading you toward death. The psychological pressure was immense. He felt trapped in a waking nightmare where the rules of reality were being subtly, maliciously bent. The force he was up against was playing a game with him, a cat-and-mouse game where the cat was invisible, intangible, and seemingly omniscient. It was not trying to harm him physically, not yet. It was trying to break his mind, to make him doubt his own senses, to turn his greatest asset, his rational intellect, into an instrument of his own undoing. His behavior became more furtive. He started checking his door for signs of tampering, leaving tiny, invisible threads to see if they would be broken. He spoke to no one about his fears, knowing they would confirm the town's suspicion that he was an unstable outsider, succumbing to the pressures of the place. He was utterly alone, isolated in his investigation, just as the witnesses had been isolated before him. He was being pushed to the fringe. He began to question who or what the observer could be. Was it a human agent, a member of the conspiracy who had been tasked with monitoring him? A local official, perhaps even the seemingly harmless Mr. Hebert, or was it something else? The supernatural explanations he had so forcefully dismissed began to creep back into his thoughts. Was it the lingering spirit of one of the witnesses, trying to warn him? Or was it the entity itself, the prime mover of the erasure, enjoying the sport of terrorizing him? The feeling of being watched followed him out of the town and into the bayou. On a preliminary trip to the edge of the Hushlands, he felt the sensation more acutely than ever. The dense, silent swamp seemed to have a million unseen eyes. Every rustle of leaves, every ripple in the dark water felt like a calculated movement. He was an intruder in a sacred, hostile space, and its guardian was fully aware of his transgression. One afternoon, he returned to his car, which he had parked on a remote dirt road, to find a single fresh sprig of Spanish moss laid carefully on the hood. It was a symbol, a calling card. It was a message from the swamp itself, a quiet, menacing acknowledgement of his presence. There was no rational explanation for it. No one had been there. The act was as silent and as untraceable as the erasure of the records. That night, Callahan made a decision. The psychological warfare had to end. He could not win a game of shadows and whispers. His only choice was to force a confrontation, to walk directly into the heart of the mystery. The entity was trying to frighten him away from his goal, which meant his goal was important. The answer to everything lay at Lafleur's Landing. He would go there, and he would face whatever was waiting for him, be it man or spectre. The time for observation was over. The time for trespass had come. Driven by a mixture of cold resolve and sheer desperation, Agent Callahan chose a day with a high, steel-grey sky to make his journey to Lafleur's Landing. He hired a small, flat-bottomed boat from a taciturn old fisherman who accepted his money but asked no questions, his eyes betraying a flicker of what looked like pity. Callahan navigated the boat himself, using the old trapper's map and a compass, pushing deeper into the labyrinthine waterways of the Black Cypress Bayou. As he entered the region, the locals called the Hushlands, a profound and unnerving silence descended. The constant drone of insects and the calls of birds faded away, leaving only the sound of his boat's small motor and the gentle slap of dark water against the hull. The cypress trees grew thicker here, their branches draped in heavy curtains of Spanish moss, blocking out the sky and creating a perpetual green-tinged twilight. The air was still and heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. Following the map's faded markings, he turned into a narrow, almost invisible tributary. The water here was unnaturally black and clear, the submerged roots of the cypress trees looking like the skeletal fingers of drowned giants reaching up from the depths. He felt a primal sense of trespass, of entering a place that was not meant for human eyes. The silence was not peaceful, it was watchful, the silence of a predator waiting for its prey to come within reach. After nearly an hour, he saw it. A small, dilapidated wooden dock, mostly reclaimed by the swamp, materialized out of the gloom. Behind it, on a small, elevated patch of ground that rose from the water like the back of some great beast, stood the remains of a cabin. This was Lafleur's Landing. He cut the engine, and the sudden, absolute silence was deafening. He tied the boat to a rotted post and stepped onto the soft, spongy earth. The cabin was a ruin, its roof caved in, its walls surrendering to the relentless assault of vines and humidity. But it was what lay around the cabin that stopped Callahan in his tracks. The small clearing was filled with dozens of small, man-made objects, arranged with a strange, ritualistic precision. They were what folklorists called bottle trees. But they were unlike any he had ever read about. The bottles were not colored glass, but clear, and they were filled with strange, murky liquids and unidentifiable objects. Even more disturbing were the wind chimes. They hung from every available tree branch, but they were not made of metal or bamboo. They were constructed from hundreds of small, yellowed bones, animal bones, he prayed, and shards of what looked like human teeth strung together on fishing line. They were perfectly still in the dead air, a silent orchestra waiting for a wind that never came. The place felt like a shrine or a prison built to appease or contain something. He cautiously entered the remains of the cabin. The interior was a single room, a mess of rotted floorboards and collapsed furniture, but in the center of the room, something had been protected from the decay. A heavy, cypress wood table stood almost perfectly preserved, and upon it an object was laid out, as if for display. It was a large, flat grey stone, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. The surface of the stone was not bare. It was covered in a sprawling, intricate carving. It was not a language, not any script he had ever seen. It was a map, but it was not a map of the bayou or of the earth. It was a star chart depicting constellations that did not exist in the known sky, arranged around a central, spiral galaxy that was both beautiful and deeply monstrous. It was a map of another place, a sky seen from a world that was not Earth. Then he saw the final, terrifying detail. At the edge of the stone map, a new carving had been recently added. It was smaller, cruder, scratched into the surface with a desperate hand. It was a single, recognizable shape, a perfect rendering of the Maglite flashlight he carried in his own hand. Someone had been here very recently. Someone had known he was coming, and had known the specific modern tool he would bring with him into this ancient place. In that moment, the conceptual horror of his investigation became a stark, immediate reality. The secret of the witnesses, the reason for their erasure, was not a human crime or a political conspiracy. It was this place. It was this knowledge. The witnesses had not just seen something, they had been the guardians of this impossible artifact, this link to another reality. Their testimony in a federal court would not have been about land. It would have been about the stars, about a truth that would have shattered the foundations of human understanding. A sudden, sharp cracking sound from behind him, a twig snapping under a heavy foot, made him spin around, his heart seizing in his chest. He was not alone. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the shadows of a large cypress, was a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its form indistinct and wavering in the dim light, as if it were made of heat haze or smoke. It made no sound, but he could feel its gaze upon him, a pressure that was both physical and psychic. He fumbled for his service revolver, his hands clumsy with terror, but he knew it was a useless gesture. The figure was not of a world where bullets mattered. It was the observer, the guardian, the entity that had erased the records and silenced the witnesses. He had found his monster, and it was older and more alien than he could have ever conceived. He had trespassed, he had seen the forbidden map, and the time for games was over. The silence of the bayou was about to be broken. What happened next at Lafleur's Landing was never recorded in any official document. There was no gunshot, no scream that echoed across the bayou. Agent Thomas Callahan's encounter with the silent observer in the twilight of the swamp remains a void, a moment of unwritten history. The only account is the one that can be pieced together from the events that followed. A new and final chapter in the cycle of erasure he had fought so hard to understand. 3 days later, the old fisherman who had rented Callahan the boat grew concerned. He ventured into the bayou himself, a place he normally avoided, and found the small, flat-bottomed boat drifting aimlessly in the main channel, miles from the hushlands. The engine was out of fuel. The compass was on the floor, its needle spinning wildly, refusing to point north. Of Agent Callahan himself, there was no sign. A search was organized, but the swamp does not give up its secrets easily. Back in Washington, D.C., Callahan's superiors grew impatient, then concerned. His weekly reports, always so punctual and precise, had stopped. His hotel in Moroville confirmed he had checked out days ago, leaving his few belongings behind. He had, for all intents and purposes, vanished. An official investigation was launched, a discreet inquiry into the disappearance of a federal agent on assignment in a remote and backward parish. The investigators sent from Washington were efficient, professional men, much like Callahan himself had been. They interviewed the parish clerk, the hotel owner, the fisherman. They found a man who had gone into the swamp and had not returned. Their conclusion was logical and tragic. Agent Callahan, an outsider unaccustomed to the dangers of the terrain, had likely gotten lost, succumbed to exposure, or fallen prey to the bayou's natural predators. His body was never recovered, but one of the investigators, a senior agent named Harris, felt a nagging sense of incompleteness. In Callahan's hotel room, he found his predecessor's meticulous notes, his hand-drawn maps, his theories of erasure and conspiracy. He saw the photograph of the solemn, forgotten Lafleur family. Harris read these notes with a growing sense of unease, seeing not the work of a man descending into paranoia, but the chillingly logical deductions of a brilliant, terrified investigator. Harris tried to follow up on Callahan's leads. He asked Mr. Hebert about the doctored records. He asked the priest about the photograph. But the wall of silence he met was even colder and more impenetrable than the one Callahan had faced. The community seemed to have collectively sealed the memory of the second government man who had come asking questions. The brief disturbance was over. The silence had been restored. Harris found every one of his inquiries blocked by a polite but unyielding void. The most disturbing discovery was made when Harris requested Callahan's original case file from the Department of Justice archives in Washington. The file arrived, but it was thinner than it should have been. The original assignment memo was there, but all of Callahan's own reports, the ones he had sent before his disappearance, were gone. Not just the physical copies, but any mention of them in the departmental ledgers. It was as if they had never been received. A quiet, unofficial directive came down from the highest levels of the department. The investigation into Agent Callahan's disappearance was to be closed. His notes were to be sealed, classified as incoherent, and the product of a stress-induced psychological breakdown. His official status was to be listed as deserted in the line of duty, a quiet stain upon an otherwise exemplary record. The erasure was happening again, but this time the target was one of their own. In the final pages of the now sealed file, a single anonymous memo is appended. It recommends that the Black Cypress Bayou, under the original pretext of a conservation project, be declared an area of permanent federal quarantine. No public access, no state jurisdiction, no further surveys. The land was to be left entirely alone, to be forgotten by the maps and by the world. The secret, it seemed, was now being kept not just by the parish, but by the very government that had sent Callahan to uncover it. The story of the vanished witnesses and the agent who followed them became a non-story, a file in a locked cabinet in a dusty room. The careful, meticulous redaction was complete. Thomas Callahan had set out to restore 5 people to the historical record, but in the end he had only managed to add his own name to the list of the vanished. He had become the final, silent witness to a truth that could not be told. The hushlands of St. Amelia Parish remain quiet, protected by law and by a deep, ancient fear. The bottle trees and the bone chimes, if they still exist, do so in a place that is no longer on any map. And perhaps, on still nights, a tall, thin figure stands guard at the edge of the black water, an eternal observer, ensuring that some secrets, and the people who learn them, are erased from the world so that the world itself can remain intact. If you like this story, leave your like and subscribe to our channel.